And we are live here on Plus One EXP's Roll for Content channel. My name is Tony Vicenda. I'm Chief Alchemist here at Plus One EXP. We're a weird little brand that multi-classes in tabletop game design, beard, and skincare alchemy in the Bardic College of Content Creation. Our hope and desire is to help amazing designers find great players who love their games and help amazing players find great designers whose games they can love. We do that in a lot of different ways, but one of my favorite ones, really, and I say I like each of the types of content we do, and it's true because that's why we do them. But I love sitting down with a group of people and having a loose outline for a conversation, and then letting us just kind of get started talking around a topic and letting you kind of step into that as the viewers. So today we have another community conversation. These are things we do once every month or so, where we sit down with a few creators who have something about their design that I really like, that I love, or that the community kind of has responded to, and have a curated conversation around that. Today we are talking maybe more abstractly than any of the other ones about where to go and what to do there. People who create these amazing locations or toolkits for use and play, and the adventures and play that allows to kind of rise out of that. Rather than me telling you about why I love all these people or who they are, because I would get things wrong, we're going to let them introduce themselves and their work. I'm super excited for all of them to be on here. I've actually played something in every one of these creators' settings, and I have played with most of these creators at some point in time. So I'm super excited to have them all on here with us. If you have any questions as we go along, drop them in the chat. Use the hashtag question at the beginning so that I know you have something you want to add. It'll help it kind of jump out to me as we're going. With that said, we're going to loop around as I see people, because I don't know how everybody is in our Google Meet, because I've got something else up that I can see. Let's start with Brian. Brian, why don't you tell people who you are, what you do, where they can find you online, and a little bit about one of the locations or some of the locations that you make.
Well, my name is Brian Yaksha. You can find me at Goatman's Goblet as either an itch or a much neglected blog, which is, I believe, just a .com, because I paid for that in advance. Let's see. What are the other questions? I just woke up.
Tell us a little bit about some of the work you do or some of the locations or toolkits you've made.
Let's see. I did the Catlands Jazz Band Gazetteer, Raquel, and a second issue which will come out sometime before the sun explodes. Soulbound stuff for Age of Sigmar. I worked on Dolmenwood. Done a few things for Pathfinder. Probably several other things that I'm not remembering.
You made a magic school.
I wrote Academies of the Arcane for Troika and Spoils of the Gorgon Coast for Best Left Buried. Yeah, I'm on top of it. As far as locations go, I sort of base things primarily around a lot of research and then tossing out anything that doesn't interest me in favor of theme. That's my modus operandi.
Awesome. We are going to hop over next to Luca. Luca, why don't you tell people who you are, what you do, and a little bit about some of the locations you've made?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tony. Hi, I'm Luca Reyes. I'm a writer and a designer and an illustrator. I made the UVG and a few other things. What was the second part of the question?
Where they can find you online. That's it. That was it. You did a good job.
Oh, right, yeah. So you can find me online under Wizard Thief Fighter on Patreon, on the website wizardthieffighter.com, and on Twitter. My hashtag, my handle is @StratoMetaship, and the reason for that is because there's a character count limit. So I couldn't actually put @WizardThiefFighter because it's too long to use as a Twitter handle. So now everybody knows. And if on Twitter you actually happen to follow my my personal Twitter under my own name, I don't post game stuff there. So I'm doing the old thing from Google Plus, where you could have different circles you would share things into. So yeah, make it easy for the people who want just the games and the art. And then about the location design and things that I've done, what I usually do is I start from the kind of game I wanted to be and the kind of game experience I wanted to be, and that then informs how I design the locations and what they do. So in the case of like something like Witchburner, which I made, all of the location, it's like one small town, and the focus is on providing the mood for what is essentially a social adventure. So there's not a very heavy emphasis on creating a precise map that players can navigate around, while some other stuff like, well, the UVG, it's built around a hex scroll with, not a hex scroll, a point crawl with different locations that the players visit, and then mechanics that are built around the way that they travel from location to location. So there, the travel from location to location, how the locations work, has a much bigger emphasis, whereas in the other one, less. Okay, that's it.
Awesome.
Next.
Traveling straight across, we've got Sam Sorensen. Sam, tell people who you are, what you do, where they can find you online, and a little bit about some of the locations you make.
Great. Hi, I'm Sam Sorensen. I have the least impressive resume here. I'm a grad student at a game center. I wrote a little zine last year called Low Life about caves and Appalachia. And I am currently writing soon-to-be-released TM, a book called Seas of Sand about a giant desert of liquid sand you can sail across. And then I have a couple other things distantly in the works,
Awesome.
which can't be announced yet. You can find me online at Head of the Goat is my Twitter handle. That's the best place to find me. I drift around on various Discord servers and stuff. Yeah, but at Head of the Goat on Twitter is the best place to find me.
Awesome. We're going to hop down to Zedek. Zedek, tell people who you are, what you do, where they can find you online, and about some of the locations that you make.
Hi, I'm Zedek. I'm ZXU. You can find me at ZXU on Twitter. Pertinent to this topic today, you can find me on, or you can find our work on thousandislands.com /blog. Because one of the I do a few things in RPGs, but most pertinent to this conversation is that I'm one half of 1,000 Islands, which is I guess it's a setting / project inspired by Southeast Asia. So we make a series of zines, and we are making a book now. But it is primarily a sort of fantasy world / setting that is inspired by the sort of material cultures and histories and lived realities of this region, the region where I'm from.
Awesome.
Yeah. So.
And last, we've got Charlie Ferguson Avery. Charlie, tell people all the things.
Hi, so I'm Charles Ferguson Avery. I'm a writer, mostly illustrator though. You can find my work at Feral Indie Studio at itch.io. I'm one half part of that. My other half of the studio is currently working right now, doing very important work. And some of the work I've done is Into the Weird and Wild. We're currently working on another book involving a infinitely sized city. And let me think. Oh, right. The Vast and the Dark. Those are the three that I can think of that are pertinent to today as far as creating a setting.
I know that I know you're a little weary of talking about it, but also, would you mind telling folks who are here a little bit about what Zine Month is that's happening all of February to just kind of cue folks into that?
Yes. So Zine Month is, not to malign it too much, but in replacement for Zine Quest. It is a community-driven event where people can look to fund their zines. They can look to promote them over the course of February on any platform that they want. And as long as they get in contact with me, anyone on the Discord, and submit to the Zine Month site, we will display it there, which then in addition to that, the Zine Month site is a place for educating people on how to fund zines, where they can go outside of crowdfunding sites. It is open to the entire world. It is not just English-based, it is not just US-based. It is open to everyone of any language, anywhere in the world. If you have a zine and you want to put it up for Zine Month, we will put it on the site and we will give you resources you need to make sure that you can do it to the best of your ability. So that's Zine Month.
Cool. So we're going to see a lot of cool projects coming out next month. We'll be covering a lot of them here and have a lot of the creators here on channel. So I wanted to make sure we mentioned that because it's a cool little thing happening in our wider community, but also something we have a real passion around here at Plus One. Also, I want to just kind of start out, and we can pop around for this however we want to. I'll call on people if nobody immediately has a piece. Actually, maybe we'll start with Zedek because I think based on even just your intro, it's a little bit clearer, and that's about. Is there a place for you, whether that's in your memory or that you think about, and it could be real or fictional for the most part, that kind of inspires what you do when you're thinking about creating a location? And that may be different for different iterations of it, but what is a place that kind of holds a special memory for you in a way that it inspires adventure writing or some other type of work that you do? But Zedek, would you mind leading us off with that?
Like specifically,
you can be as granular or as broad as you want in that. I mean, I like. So I'll even say this. How about I start, and I'll give you a second to think. Like I even talked about. I did a review of Into the Weird and Wild by Charlie, and one of the things I love about the setting, and one of the things that got me thinking about this whole line of thinking is, I was a kid who grew up in the woods. There was not a huge stretch of woods near my house, but there are a lot of copses of trees that, of course, when you're 8 years old, seem like huge woods. And we would go out into them as we were in elementary school, and we would come across like old wells and abandoned sheds and other things that suggested, like, probably for the first time to a small child, that you were not the first people who were here, which is something every white person everywhere should always think about. But there's a sense for me always of you had to be back before nightfall. And there were things about the woods around my house that hold a sense of magic and place and adventure for me growing up. That when I think about what I want in an adventure, at the table, lots of times that's the feeling I'm chasing, right? It doesn't have to be woods, but I want that sense of wonder to kind of come into play. That's me. Your answer could be totally different or have nothing to do with any of that stuff. Right, okay. But the woods around my house growing up are certainly that for me.
Well, I think I relate to the idea of, the immediacy, like something in your, in the sort of anecdote you just shared is the idea that the woods, you were in them. I think when it comes to the supernatural, at least if you ask anybody from my region of the world, it's as much as we want to project as sort of like, oh, we are advanced or modern or like contemporary, it is the idea of the right here is the forest is the jungle, right? And you just have to step outside and you feel that. So there's a thing about how whether or not you believe in the sort of in the magic of the landscape is magical. So there is a sense of, I think when it comes especially to sort of experiences of fantasy or imagination where you want to have this sort of imaginative experience going on an adventure. I think at least from, and I'm not sure whether this is true for you guys, and I would like to hear you share whether this is the case, but especially when it comes to the stuff that I write and the work that me and Macau do in Thousand Islands, it is there is a sense of realness, a sense of like, okay, this is really creepy, and it's not creepy in the sort of like, you know how like the modern horror genre is a modernist medium. It's not that way with us. And I think like one of our early zines that me and Macau made together, a zine called Hantu, kind of communicates this idea that in the horror genre as a modernist construction is not the case here. So like like films, for example, that are made in Southeast Asia, or sorry, not Southeast Asia, but Malaysia specifically, oftentimes they are horror comedy, because horror is too close. Because the reality is a kind of horror. So you kind of have an escape valve where it's okay to be slightly. It's a satire of a horror movie is a satire. A horror comedy is a satire of a realist movie.
I love that.
And I'm not sure. And I'm kind of going on a tangent, but this kind of explains the sort of difference in tone, I think, when we make 1,000 Islands. Me and Maka were talking about it just today in a meeting with somebody else. The sensation that we want to figure out what it's like to tell a story or imaginative story that is true to our lived reality, as opposed to something that is legible to a sort of audience that is from a Western context, who has certain ideas of what fantasy is and what realism is, or horror is, or like science fiction. It feels very. Sorry, I feel like I'm talking in very abstract terms, but.
No, and I was saying this before we went live, like some of the other conversations we have, they're very like specific and grounded. This one is very, in a lot of ways, broad, but I love that. Like, and I love the context. I think a lot of the times when I look at the work that you do, or when we play together, there's a sense of imminence, right? The sense that this is a place right outside that I think your work drives home beautifully, and I think that's a lot of what you're talking about.
And actually, so that's. I mean, a complication of that is that one of the requirements for 1,000 Islands, for me and Maka specifically, is the idea that nothing in our zines or in our work can be a real thing. So, for example, like in the zine Hantu that I mentioned, none of the spirits that are described in that book are actual spirits that people like the Pontianak or the Penanggalan, these are spirits from the sort of Malay Nusantara region, which people truly believe in. So we cannot have like, okay, I'm going to write an adventure that has the Pontianak as the villain. We cannot do that, because that's a poverty of imagination, right? Because it's like Tolkien not inventing the Hobbit. But the idea is to get the feel. So I guess in analogous terms, what Maka and I want to seek to create is equivalent to the way sort of Western writers like Tolkien or whoever else invent things like The Hobbit, which don't have a realness, but feel like they are real from the context which they come up.
Yeah.
If there's like specific things that so like a lot of these things do arise from specific things in my life. So a lot of like one of our zines, the Crocodile zine, comes from the river in my home state, which is full of like saltwater crocodiles. Like an adventure I wrote for Best Left Buried, Spy in the House of Eth, references specifically a sort of gas flare that's outside my window. I'm not sure whether it's visible from Twitch, but it's if you can see the door right there, it's visible through the door. That's a bright light there. So
I can make it visible on Twitch. Hold on, I can move things around real quick.
We're gonna move your camera remotely. There we go.
Yeah.
So that's not a street light. That's the gas flare.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna break the paneling so that maybe people can get a little bit more of a sense of it.
And
door
yet
right
I
there.
can't help notice all of the darkness around that light. I'm so used to the light pollution of New York City.
Oh,
Yeah.
So that, and I think that's an interesting illustration of how industrial my context is, but also how and the darkness is really, a lot of it is oil palm plantations, right? It's also industrial. But the oil palm plantations are full of ghosts and pythons, and until very recent, I mean, another thing is the tiger is like facing extinction in Malaysia. But 30 years ago, there was a photograph of in one of the rubber estates, like my neighbor's dad was part of a party that had to shoot a tiger because it was killing people in the estate. So it's that kind of, I don't know. I've rambled on enough. So.
No, thank you so much. It was a great starting point for it. Yeah, and if you have that much, that's great. If you have less, that's great. But let's hop over to Brian, because we got a strong oh yeah from you just a second ago. Tell us a little bit about a place for you that you're trying to recapture when you're writing.
Well, the oh yeah was in response to not presenting real spiritual things as though they are Fantasyland. Things like it's just like in this, we have Lathander, the sun god, and over here is the entire Egyptian pantheon. Don't worry about it. We're not going to explore why that's here. They're just here. And it's like you couldn't even just like come up with a different name for something that inhabits these same symbols. You just wholesale have it. That's disrespectful. And
Sorry, I just want to jump back into what Brian says, because like it occurs to me that a conversation that me and Marco had recently is like one of the reasons why we don't do this is that, look, I mean, admitting this might paint me as like superstitious or whatever in a sort of Western context, but I don't want to piss off anything.
No, that's fair.
let me like,
no, that's 100% valid. And
not anybody, like any of the real creatures. Like I don't like.
Yeah, no, I love it. And that's a great, like, let's just pause right there. We can go back to like key locations. Like for each of y'all as you're creating, is there a way that any of y'all particularly approach that piece, right? Like when you're writing in spirits, when you're writing in cultures, when you're writing any of those pieces to the locations you're making. How much consideration do you give to any of those pieces, or what's a way you've given consideration to some of that?
What do you mean by consideration?
Thought. Like, what's a way that you approach that?
I mean, like Zedek said about places, I never write about real places or real things. It's not necessarily just a question of respect. It's also a question of, it's a poverty of imagination. If you're making a fantasy thing, an imaginary thing, to just take something that already exists, or take an existing fantasy and remake it, it just feels sort of like I'd be retreading ground that has already been trodden. To make something that's, for example, like let's say I decided to make a gazetteer that was a full-on accurate recreation of a certain part of the world in the 15th century, right down to the rules for like how the firearms and dress and so on were used and what kind of food was eaten. I would just feel incredibly bored, because that's just a research project. And, like putting out that kind of, I wouldn't be able to make myself do it. So that's a major consideration. And then the other one is, partly there's a question of how to deal with real places with tact and respect. The other thing is also, it's just riskier. It's more of a liability. You can be as careful as you want. You can always, put your foot in your mouth in some way, and it'll come down on you. And if you instead just make things up, there's less risk of that. But even when making things up, people come to you and it's like, did you mean this real world place? Which actually happened to me. And then I was just like, what? I didn't even know it existed.
Awesome. I love it. Luca, how about you though? Is there a place that kind of holds primacy or a good place in your memory that you like think inspires the work that you make?
I mean, a lot of the work is not necessarily about primacy or good memories. It's about interrogating, questioning the places that I've lived, the places that I've experienced, the things that I've experienced. And I've lived around a bit. As a kid, we moved to Africa, so I spent many years there. And then by the time we came back to Europe, the country I'd been born in didn't exist anymore. So, you know, and since then I've lived in a few different countries. So all that does inform a certain sense of the impermanency of human geography and also physical geography. Like, things change. And so there's a very real sense of you're in a place. The saying that you can't step into the same river twice applies very much to place as well. And so the place I grew up in no longer exists. I mean, the town is still there, but, you know, it's now a different country. It's now a different empire. And so the way all places pass and change, and the way we can't return to them, and the way it's actually interesting because there's always something new, is something that definitely informs it. And then for a whole set of the things I write, they are, in one way or another, they're like a little bit of an ode, but also a satire of the places I grew up in.
Love it. Your art, it's really funny you mentioned that. Like, your article on anti-canon and team brewing is something that I send people regularly when I try to explain the way that we do world building. But I love that touchstone of things are always different when you go back to them, and it's one of my favorite things about like team brewing is actually watching the way that even if you're in the same town or city for the entirety of an adventure, things should be happening, and people at the table should be able to speak into how those things change. And a strong canon, if a book has an overly strong canon for locations and world, I find it stagnates them very quickly.
It ossifies it. It's like the thing that really gets me with some published settings. You come to that setting and it's huge, it's massive, and then it's like you invest so much time memorizing this whole setting, or like as the DM, you invest all this time making this detailed setting, and then the players come and it's like, oh yeah, we want to blow this up, for example, or there's this big bad that is going to wreck things, and they're like, yeah, we're scared, we're not going to face them. And then it's all of a sudden, oh my God, I've invested so much time and effort in this fantasy place, and now they're just going to let it get changed.
Yeah.
And then there's this, and I did this like when I was starting out, like DMing and so on. I'd write this really detailed setting and like do maps for like the rainfall patterns and everything and so on. And then it's like, okay, and now we want to skip 20 years into the future. Oh God, I don't have anything prepared.
Yeah. I have a friend who, Sam Lee, who's Goblin Mixtape over on Twitter and does some really great work on TikTok right now, just flashed forward 5 years in their Blades and in their Blades in the Dark setting. Like, they did a 5-year flash forward so that they could, because that's how much time they figured they were going to need to plan out their mission. And it's such a beautiful take on, like, I know people will be like, well, that's going to take a month, and so we're going to flash forward a month, and that can seem like a lot, but they're like, there's consideration given to how the entire city has changed in that 5 years that's happening in that process. And it's just a really cool thing to see happening at tables. But it's hugely influential in what we did for Down We Go and for Through the Void is a lot of those same touchstone concepts that don't just ask people to consider that, but kind of throw it right in your face and say, no, every time you leave this city and you come back, things have inherently and implicitly changed, and you need to figure out what is different now whenever you come to this location. But I love that concept of interrogating it, and I love the constant shift in those things. Sam, we haven't heard much from you yet. I know it's early for some of us and late for other ones. Tell us a little bit about some of the locations that kind of inspire your work.
So I'm going to take the opposite tack to Luca and say that almost all of my work is super grounded in research. So at the risk of just outing myself as a huge geek, most of my work on RPGs starts at the library. Of like, I go hunting for books that I want to find. and I check a whole bunch of them out and skim through them and look through their indexes and find articles and find photos and find whatever I can find, and then try to get all of that through osmosis, so it's percolating when I write, so that you have things to draw on and not just like a touchstone, but like a more sort of like, if I can get my own head in that space, then I can start working from it. Which means that for more historically inclined projects, if it's sci-fi, if it's Mothership, then it's very different. But if it's for something like Low Life, which has a pretty strong sense of setting, kind of the late 19th, early 20th century, for me that was absorbing as much media and as much history and as much as much of the culture almost doesn't exist anymore. I'm sure it does somewhere, but I don't know where to go looking for it in real life. But I mean, like, reading as many books as I could find, looking through articles, watching old documentaries and news clips from the 20s of trying to figure out, like, what was this like? So for me, that stage of research and going hunting for things is very important. In terms of literal places for Low Life, the thing that struck me about it is me and some friends were wandering around at some point, and we found like an old train tunnel, or like the beginnings of one. And it was like 7:30 in the evening, and we were all too chicken to go inside because it was like a low ceiling. It was like 6 foot high, and there were some spider webs. Oh god, my roommates. Sorry, hold on. Let me come back to me.
Awesome. I always talk about like Sam's work, like even at the beginning of this, like Sam's work is very much science to me. Like, not to say there's not a lot of creativity that happens in that space, but it is incredibly pure. Like Charlie, your work for me always feels a lot more like magic, right? Like they both have systematic approaches to them, but they both have some type of cohesion of logic within them. But there's still a very different tone and flavor. So we'll hop over to you real quick. What kind of tell us a little bit about more locations that maybe influence or inspire some of the work you do?
Just to like give a little more breadth to Sam, like I love the idea of like putting in research into a setting, and where, once again, like you said, it's not about like building everything down like in the style of Luca's, like 15th century complete recreation of like this time period and this place, but instead about getting your brain into that circle, and once it's in that circle you can build from the ground up because you have this foundational understanding of the place. In my case, it's with a lot of my stuff that is kind of like how I try to approach certain, like, some of my settings. Like in the case of Into the Weird and Wild, like, always grew up in the woods. We've taken hunting trips up there. I've done bushwhacking up through there. It's it is a place that is near and dear to me. And while I would never be so arrogant to say that I understand it, I understand that I don't understand it. And and that kind of like built into the Weird and Wild. It was a collection of like memories and experiences. I was also kind of working through some stuff at the time, so like that sort of shows through here and there. But and I've kind of like carried that same spirit with most of the things that I've done. Like in the case of Vast in the Dark, it was God, what was that built off of? I think that was just built off of a fascination of I think like brutalist architecture, megastructures, stuff like that. It was kind of like, as much as I love Vast in the Dark, it was much more of a mishmash and much more based on emotional tone than it was like research into a place. Weird and Wild came from a place that I knew. Vast in the Dark was a little bit more of an exploration of mood, feeling, tone. I was also working through stuff during that. I hate to think that a lot of like personal stuff and emotional baggage influences what I create, but I do believe that there's a little bit of that.
Yeah, I was gonna say the Vast of the Dark. There are very few RPGs I've read that are more like, oh, so this is about facing the oblivion of death. Just memory loss, just trapped. It'll just fade into nothing, lose the self.
Yeah,
It's
that came
very
out during
good.
the pandemic, didn't it? Oh boy.
Yeah, came out
yeah.
during the pandemic. Hit me right when I was going through some existential stuff, and it was just like, well, I get it and I appreciate it, but
Hey,
I'm
you're
gonna
not
go read
alone.
some happy things, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, as much as I would love to write more happy stuff, it does not come naturally to me. And I like to think
Oh
I'm
yeah.
a pretty cheerful fellow, but not the stuff I write though.
Oh yeah, right there with you. I had someone come and ask me if I could write for them just the other day. I was like, fine. And then I was like, wait, no, can it not be something that makes me hate looking at my bookshelf? Because I'm a research-based person. And as a research-based person, like I used to do comics and stuff, but like background in criminology. And it's like, hey, you can only write about like the fear of like Satanism in America if you have a really, really unfortunate bookshelf, which makes you not feel safe.
That's fair.
Yeah.
I love it, Brian. Any places in your life that kind of stand out to you as the ones that influence you?
100% my hometown in upstate New York, which is sort of a wonderful capstone on like a failed town. In that, let's see, notably, these are things that I know about it. We were the only place to house Jewish refugees during World War II, but we did effectively put them in a camp in our town. We were supposed to get the UN building, but then they were like, actually, this World's Fair place looks a lot nicer. And the whole reason we were supposed to get the UN building is because we housed those Jewish refugees. The Black Hand was operating in our town during the 1910s, the Serbian terrorist organization, apparently. Let's see. When I was a teenager, our mayor was involved in human trafficking for drugs while his wife, a kindergarten teacher, was going through chemo, and he still operates the auto garage in town. People have described my hometown as a cursed place, and when I talk about it, they're like, so are you just from Twin Peaks? And I'm like, no, it's a lot more damp and vaguely Irish coded. But it's like, so it's this case of,
somebody just typed Riverdale into the chat.
Oh God. But it's this case of just, the intimacy of that sort of situation where it's like people, they want, I don't know, whenever I've been having to do research on like people who do like town settings or cities, and I have said many times when I've written anything related to cities, like you will never know a city. You will never truly know a city. You can think you do it, you will encounter a vertical slice of it, but you will never truly know it. And the same is true of a small town. You can know everyone in it, but the deep cruel insanity of it all behind, just under that thin layer of flesh of vague civility. Oh, it's eldritch and gnarled. It's horrifying. And like, it's one of those things where it's sort of like you kind of have to either escape it and forget about it entirely, or you have to embrace it. And sadly, I found myself embraced by it because just, it's bizarre. Like I wrote a whole zine called Home, which was vague reflections of this idea of you can never truly return to your hometown because you're trying to return to an idea of like nostalgia and homely comforts, but things will always change. And it's almost cruel to try and return to your hometown because it's this desire to return to childhood and to, at the same time, even if that's not your intent, you will see other people who have gone into that and desired that and failed at that, and it's just sort of like you see that ambition snuffed. And I'm happy that I have been embraced by the madness of my hometown, using that in full context of it being a maddened place. But I'm also happy to have escaped, and it's weird to see the radicalization of having gotten out. I like how it comes into my work, because it's like a lot of people, like when they're writing violence in their work, they forget like the petty casualness of it, even though they are portraying like, oh yeah, and the bandits attack, and it's like, no, they don't, unless they're being petty and cruel, in which case they do attack, but it needs to feel petty and cruel and born of this sadness and this desperation and this anger at the fact that you do not care and you don't care. And even if you could care, you would never know this as they know this. And it's not worth trying to explain it. So we're going to take your money and we're going to hurt you. And so that's where a lot of my stuff comes from thematically, is finding that strange creature lurking underneath this human guise of a place. My meds have started to kick in. So,
Wow.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question for Brian and Sam, who both appear to be more research-based, while I take a more impressionistic approach to to locations. So one thing I find with writing anything for games is that there are essentially three steps. There's the source idea or the source thing, which I somehow perceive. So in my case, it's like it sort of boils up out of my subconscious in my brain with more or less research. And then I try to translate that into a kind of slice or cross section that can represent that in a document, which is then translated into a live play experience at a table by a group of players. So if you take a research-based approach, how do you take that, like when you research a thing and it's huge, how do you decide which part of that to transfer to the paper?
Oh, I just cut out anything that is not inherently interesting. And so I wrote Raquel because I did not like Zweihander. I actually looked up, like, why did I start writing this? Like, oh, look at this book with a big German name that has nothing German in it.
So how do you decide what is not interesting?
It doesn't invoke curiosity, which
you're saying
probably
for
the
you
meanest thing I'm
specifically.
gonna
Like
say.
if somebody else finds it interesting, that's fine. But for you, it
yeah,
was not.
good for them.
Yeah.
I wish I could. I would enjoy many things much more. I'd be a happy person. I'm not. But so I will find something and then I'll be like, okay, and then I'll do some broader research. And it's like, all right. So in the case of researching for Raquel via coming from Zweihander, it's just like, yo, where are the Snolligasters? Where are the Korngeists? Where are all these interesting, where are the Schnabelperkten? Like, come on. Where are these cool, extremely Germanic things in your extremely Germanic named game? And so I started writing my own thing, and I'm like, what's a place that can allow me to make my favorite language that I love to mock, and that is French, because I took 8 years of it and I will never use it. And I was like, oh, I can write about ostensibly fantasy Alsace-Lorraine. And in doing so, it's like, let me write about the idea of like the homo nullus, the unpeopled people who are in exile, people who are not deemed to be important and are, therefore like outside of society. And so it's a matter of looking at this region and finding the interesting thematic keynotes and building something that is not like, it is not Alsace-Lorraine, and it's certainly barely even fantasy Alsace-Lorraine, but it's built on the root integrity of the symbols that one can associate with war in that region. And so that serves as the bones. So that's sort of like when you're talking about like percolating this original idea, that's sort of what I'm like, what I do with research. It's just me trying to find like the depths to which I can take this concept and just, really mess around with it and make it into something without necessarily losing that theme. Sam, how do you do it?
I do it very differently.
Oh.
Nothing that, I mean, I wish, I found, the thing that I have realized in hanging out in RPG spaces is that I am, like, not a fundamentally creative person. Of, like, I never, Luca, you mentioned, like, oh, having subconscious dreams and inspire your work, and that never happens to me, ever. And so instead, a lot of creativity for me is finding things and then twisting on them and riffing on them and modifying them. So for me, the question that always sort of echoes and emanates through all my work when it starts with research is saying, okay, I have this research and I have usually like one semi-decent fantasy idea that I'm going to inject into it, right? Of like, in the case of Seas of Sand, this desert book, it's saying, okay, it's a desert, and during the day it's liquid, and at night it's solid. And so then it says, okay, I have this one idea, and I've done a whole bunch of research on deserts, both ecologically and culturally and historically and semiotically and stuff. And now I have this notion of, okay, I have this cool gameplay mechanic that I stole from something else about it being liquid during the day and hard at night. And then if those things are true, what else is true? And so for me, building a setting is an extremely, procedural is the wrong word, but it's a very it's a very step-by-step process of, it's always about saying, okay, I have this thing that is true. So if the sands are liquid, then that means there have to be things that swim through them, which means that there have to be things that can breathe under the water when it cools and hardens at night, or under the sand when it cools and hardens at night, which means you need something keeping it warm at the bottom, which means now you have an ecology system where there's heat emanating from the base and it rises. And like now that's kind of interesting and weird of like, oh, you have this convection current that's constantly cycling, and it's the sun that tips it over from hot enough to be liquid back to cool enough at night. And now you say, okay, if this is true, then how did people get around on this originally? Like, well, they have ships now, but what did they do in the old days? And so it's that process of constantly building out. And so my notes are always filled with just reams and reams of questions and like problems to solve. And a player will ask something of like, oh, what did they do before boats? Or what do they eat? And then suddenly I have to do more research because I'm looking at what the real things are. And I have this existing fantasy context that has to be smashed together. And so it's this very, organic is the wrong word, but it's a very like self-spiraling process. And then eventually someone says, Sam, you have to publish this. Yeah, it's very iterative. And then eventually I hit my deadlines on Kickstarter and I have to publish. And so whatever pointed out there has to be written down and sent out. Otherwise, I will just keep working on projects for years and they'll never go anywhere.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I understand that. Like all of my works are less finished than I would want. All of the finished ones are less finished than I would want.
Yeah, no. I think it's Guillermo del Toro who said that your dreams should always exceed your budget. And initially I really resented that. Like, what are you talking about? You gotta be in scope. You gotta like have, you gotta make sure that you can fit everything. But eventually I'm like, no, like there's always more stuff out there.
Is Guillermo del Toro making RPGs? Because that sounds like he's making RPGs.
I wish he was. That'd be sick. I would love to play a Del Toro RPG.
My dreams always exceed my budget.
Yeah.
So, no, I love it. A couple questions from the chat, and if anybody else has ones, we can hop back in. Really basic one from Lawful Neutral is, what sort of music do you listen to as you write settings?
I don't. I find music, and this is a very specific thing for me that I've said to people before, and they're always like, "Oh, that's not normal." Music too deeply affects me. To the point where I have to have like television on, just a noise that I can tune out while I'm working, because if it's music, I just get like, it too deeply colors my work. And I've used that to some effect in the past, but if a song that I am nostalgic for, or like Louis Armstrong, comes on a playlist at random, we're just going to be in a sad space for a little bit, and that's not useful. That probably has more about my mental health than my process, but that's what I listen to. Primarily old sitcoms from the 90s.
Look for your next RPG setting, the back lot of a '90s television studio. It's a point crawl. No, but I get that. I'm a talk person, so like I always have podcast or other stuff going in the background, not music, unless it's just totally instrumental or ambient. I can handle that, but anything with lyrics, I can't. What about anybody else have music that particularly inspires them?
I mean,
yeah. I vaguely recall that UVG is chock full of music references, isn't it?
Yeah.
Did you?
Were you listening? Yeah, of course.
Were you listening to those things as you were making them? Right,
yes,
right,
yes. Right. Yeah, of course. I mean, I tend to listen to music when I write. So yeah.
But
like,
those particular genres specifically.
Yes. Yes. I actually have like a blog post with like a long playlist of like I don't know, like 50 different albums that went for that, and then some people took it and made the UVG playlists on Spotify and then YouTube. So I actually didn't make most of those, which blew my mind that people like took these things that I was listening to and made playlists. But sometimes I actually like some of the things that I write actually even like start with like a song that I like, and then it's like the story spirals from there. Like the recent one, Let Us In, is it all started like I heard this song by a band called Unseen Guest, and the song is called Let Me In. And that's where it started. And then I had like the whole story, exactly how to set the whole thing up. I had it in my head for like 3 years, but I never had the time to sit down and take like 3 weeks to put it together. So I finally put it together. So lots of times it's like that. And sometimes it's with like a bigger delay. So if anybody's interested right now, they can listen to an album by an interesting band called Vespero, and the album title is Subkraut U-Boats Willkommen hier.
Could you drop that in Twitter to me, Luca, and I'll find it and I'll drop it in the chat.
Yeah.
Is that related to something you're working on right now?
Yes, but it's very far away.
But
yeah.
I wonder whether this is true for like that's interesting, the question about music, because like I think like Brian, the music I listen to almost has to be a sort of like tonal. Sorry, forgive me if I'm misunderstanding you, Brian, but like when I listen to music as I write, if I at all, the sort of music I listen to has to be a sort of tonally at odds with what I'm working on. So I found that when I'm writing like for Thousand Islands recently, I've been listening to this channel on YouTube called it's Hur or Hor Berlin. It's this like electro music DJ sort of like in a sort of kitchen or a bathroom really, where they like, and it's just like electro music. So it's like totally unrelated to the kind of work I do. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah,
it works.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just, I grew up in a house with 3 brothers, 3 dogs, 2 parents, lots of noise everywhere. So when I was able to get music, like I grew up with tape player that went to the CD player that went to the MP3 player. It was sort of a very borderline sacred thing to just be able to enjoy something that only I could hear.
Right.
And so like, and also, like the music that you grow up with and then you don't get to hear for like a decade is going to affect you differently. So yeah, there's a reason why when I'm writing the most violent stuff, I need to be watching the Bob Newhart show in the background, which, just to not be in my own head dwelling on this stuff or too subsumed in something that's attempting to create emotion.
Jesus.
That's a reference. It goes from here to here, and I don't even see it.
Oh, I could talk about Bob Newhart all day, but that is absolutely not why we're here.
Yeah.
Really, I mean, come on, this is exactly what we're here for. Sorry.
That's people want to know
Ignore
that
me.
Bob Newhart is the secret.
Yeah,
And so-
I mean, yeah, just look at him. He's a very old man now.
Oh, we got Skullboy in the chat. Hey Sam, how's it going? Good to see you. I can't wait to hang out with you next month for some stuff also. Luca, did you have something you want to say? Or are you waving to Sam?
No, I was waving to Skullboy.
Oh yeah.
Awesome. Any other thoughts on music? Otherwise, we've got another question I'm going to hop to.
Just one. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, well, mine's quick. It's I don't listen to music because I can't focus when I write. I can when I draw. And technically, Into the Weird and Wild was inspired by In the Woods Somewhere by Hosier. You can find all of my creative process in that single song, I would argue.
Awesome.
I just wanted to add that I got the absolutely horrifying statistic at the end of last year that I have 191,000 minutes of time on Spotify, which is about half my waking hours. So I can't do anything without music.
Right. I just want to add something else to add, which is this thought just literally just occurred to me. One of the reasons why I may not listen to music that is kind of like in tune with like a sort of mood I'm trying to create in the writing is that, for one thing, that I think the place of music in like that is congruous with the imagination that I'm trying to write from, it doesn't quite exist. In that, the Southeast Asian sort of those sounds don't fulfill the same place as sort of pop music does, that you can put on earphones and have it on while you're writing. So yeah, that's one thing. The other thing about music that I thought might be relevant in terms of world building, like our topic today, is like something that I was recently listening to and occasionally return to. So like this is the closest thing musically that is related to the act of world building. Is there's an album called Music and Poetry of the Cash, which was a collaboration between Ursula Le Guin and I can't remember her, a musician called Todd Barton. She made this album with him of music tracks for a book called Always Coming Home, which is kind of like, if you do look at it, it's sort of like a role-playing game campaign setting, or like Gazetteer, because it is poetry and recipes and stories and places and like the layout of towns of this post-collapse Californian society. So I just thought that.
If you drop me a link to that, I'll put that in the chat also too. But
yes,
I will say for it was really fun. Like originally for Down We Go, we were like, we're gonna do a cassette because that's the hipster dungeon synthy thing to do right now in RPGs. It'll be fun to do. But as we got into it, we were working with Loot the Body, who did the work for like a Zag and a couple of other things with Lex Mandrake that I really love. And it's a really interesting type of world building to think about the music and the sounds of the place that you are. Like we always talk about, like include all five senses, but that process kind of unfolded after the first song of I would give Loot the like a sound that I thought was really important to the setting or a set of sounds, and it might be like the clinking of coins in the marketplace, and then we would riff off the other sounds surrounding that to create a little bit more of an embodied space. We haven't announced this yet outside of our one channel on our server. We just brought Will Yobst on to do a set of 4 to 6 sounds for Through the Void when we go to funding. And it was because I enjoyed the world building process of making that music so much. And it'll be weird electronic space noises and like a mishmash of different cultural pieces for like aliens and humans and other things all thrown together. But it'll be weird and experimental ambience music, but it's also, it does bring a sense of place to the world to start to think about those things in an intentional level. And that's something you're going to do for every project, but it was a fun piece of world building that we got to do for Infinopolis and then the Eternus Station eventually. Oh, go ahead.
No, I mean, music, like, and what you just said is really cool, because it occurs to me, like a conversation that me and Michael had about me, because this has come up before in context of music, but also in context of food, is that like creating music for 1,000 Islands would be a challenge, because what kind of instruments would the period in which we are trying to create from have had? Similar to music, similar to food, where it's like, what would food in the Southeast Asian region be like before the Columbian exchange? A lot of essential ingredients in where I live now in my society right now come from the Columbian exchange, like stuff like chilies, right? So it's an interesting thing to think about, these very specific and very concrete things that, and how that relates to world building. Like, how does the availability of certain sounds or certain tastes or inavailability of those things affect what you make in a space and how people interact with that space?
It's almost like, not to dwell on it too much, but like it's kind of that inverse of you are creating a place that, you know, is essentially fantasy, that exists outside of reality, you know, well, like, you know, the current world and all that jazz. But you do end up having to do, if not research, at least consideration on it, because it is like, you know, as you said, like the Columbian exchange, you have like, you know, like if you were going to make music for Thousand Island, it's like, okay, well, we have to take out all of this, but then we might have to add this because this never happened, and this is, you know, unfortunately makes up the cultural landscape. Like, you know, I can think of 1,000 ways that like is the case in the United States. But you almost have to do research, or at least make these like kind of like philosophical considerations. Which stuff for it.
Which sort of dovetails into the previous question about like when you do research and when you do the reading or the assemblage of the factual information, what do you throw out? What do you use? It's like that thing. Even though it may be simple as, you know, this thing speaks to me or this thing doesn't interest me, it has to be a conscious decision almost. Or a subconscious decision, or you have to build a knowledge base to be able to let your subconscious make the decision.
The thing that you design when it comes to locations and places, like one of the key things is you should do it intentionally, I think. So so the same comes with music, language, food, all the other parts that you include. There should be intention behind it. So even when it comes to like completely making things up, I actually completely agree with what Sam was saying before about how like things follow one to another, and so I try to also make things intentionally. And on a tangent with the music, one thing that I actually want to try to do with the project at some point is to explicitly link like a world in the game and locations to an actual playlist, so that each location will have its own tunes to go with it, so that if you play it through, you actually, you know, get like, well, you get to play through the game, but you also get to play through the playlist and go in order. So
I've done that in my home games. You have things with themed music, and like I remember one of my most proud moments with my players being like, "Oh, it's the music from this place. We must be near it." Like,
yeah.
I love what you said about like food, because for me that's actually the thing that comes up both in play more often, but it's, I mean, like you can look at me in person and tell that food may be more influential to me than music. But no, like what people eat in a place, the things for that, like even playing when we got to play in the Reach of the Roach King, or the Roach God, like having the tea house as the central location that we come to, and getting to explore that, and even some of the things that come up of like what is meat to the creatures we were encountering, like those types of visceral realities, like for me, ground me in a location far more than almost anything else, right? Because they include both taste, sense, there's carnality to it, and that creates a strong sense of place. So like for me, what people are eating or what the food is there, you know, for Sam on the Sea of Sands, like how provisions are handled, like those are very grounding practical things rather than just having rations, or in Charlie's case being able to eat gold in the wild. The like I love being able to see that, because again, like one of the reasons I love Weird and Wild is I'm the person who's like, we killed a thing, I am probably going to dissect it and carve it up, and I want pieces of its body for both treasure as well as like, hey, is this going to help us survive over the course of this adventure, right? That's a weird character trait player trait that embodies itself in my characters a lot of the time.
Well, to be fair, that's like the reason I do that is because I always think that like if somebody's going to be an adventurer, at least in these kind of stereotypical fantasy settings, you know, yeah, they need everything. Like, why would they ever go hungry? Like, they're like, you know, in that sort of like grim way, is like, as long as there's something like running around in the woods or something, like, you'll get something to eat. It's when there's not anything, that's when the problems arise.
Could I bounce off of the food thing?
Yeah.
Like a thought just struck me. Has there been any adventure that dealt with or like setting and so on that actually covered with what happens usually about between like 8 and 24 hours after a human eats food?
I have seen
has that part, like the way a society deals with, you know, waste, pooping. Yes, that doesn't even ever come
any
up. Like,
dungeon that takes place in a sewer.
Yeah. No, but the typical thing is the dungeons or like the fortresses which don't have toilets.
Right.
You know?
I will say.
Arguably,
I don't know whether this answers your question, Luca, but like something that is not yet ready to be published yet, because we're trying to save it for like our 5th year anniversary compendium or whatever, which we haven't really planned or announced. So I shouldn't be talking about it.
Yeah.
But there is in one of our sort of sections or zines that we've slated, there is a shit god. And the sort of the settling / sewage pools of it, because you're right in that the sort of sanitation, especially if you're building a sort of urban environment.
Yeah, of course.
Sanitation and sort of irrigation and how it relates to irrigation, because it's very closely linked.
Cucumbers.
So like there is like that sanitation, the settling pools of where all the shit goes and how the shit gets there, and who deals with the shit, and like who venerates it, and what happens to it. Is there a spirit? Is there that's all like.
Lawful Neutral again in the chat says there's a J Lake story that fits into this, where eating is seen as foul but excreting is seen as holy. Lawful Neutral, if you want to drop me that over on Discord, a link to that, I'll drop it in the chat also too. But that sounds amazing. But no, like those.
So, but when it, if I may, just one thing. So the reason it also comes to it is because there's actually a historical event from my home country of Slovenia, where there was a robber baron who was also a highwayman. So he and his merry men would rob goods and cargo that was traveling between the port and the Adriatic in Vienna. And he had a castle built inside a cave. It's quite spectacular. You can visit it. And at a certain point, robbing goods isn't a great thing. So eventually, the law, or let's say the local duke, came to take him to court, and he just went into his castle, and they besieged him. And because there was like a secret entrance through a cave system, they could actually get resupplies from elsewhere. And at one point during the siege, to mock the soldiers besieging them, they threw a whole roast boar over the battlements at them to show them, like, we've got plenty of food. You know, this is not going to work. And the siege eventually ended. So they had like the small, like the 15th century cannons or 16th century, and they were firing at the castle. And the siege eventually ended when this robber baron died, because a cannonball killed him while he was taking a shit. because the toilets for the nobles, it was basically built out, sticking out of the wall of the castle, so that like everything would just drop down into the moat. And cannonball, bathroom cannonball.
But what a way to go.
I love it. But those are like, again, that's a part of like when we're thinking about locations, we're oftentimes, and Jian Shim is probably one of the best people that I feel like thinking through this, the ecosystem concept of things. And so like the fecal realities of a location are just as important as the food ones, as a lot of the other pieces that we oftentimes touch on. We oftentimes pass over them, but they have a very, except maybe Crapland, but that's just a,
Oh yeah, there it is.
Yeah, there it is.
But no, it's so much good there. Also, the name of the J Lake story is The Lizard of Ooze, and Lawful Neutral dropped some details in the chat for that. A great question for people who are more research oriented, or anybody who has maybe a thought on this, because I think as much as Sam and Brian, you may grant it, that I think everybody kind of hit on it at least at some point, like how you start to gather the information. But how do you organize your research process, and what advice would you give to learners who are just starting to think about world or location building?
Most of what you think is important, nobody will care about. Stop it. Stop it. Right now, just stop. You find like the 3 cool things, and then you just go from there. Do not skew generic. I believe I've probably actually said this on a previous interview with Tony. Don't give me, here's a D100 for stuff on a river. Give me a named river and a bunch of stuff you're happy to tell me about this named river. And if I don't like that name, I can change it, but I will feel more invested because you made it seem like an actual place rather than another set of rules about hypothermia for generic mountain lands. You got to give me something. When it comes to research, if you are a white person, maybe stay in your lane. That's very good advice that you should take to heart. And don't just try and recodify something because people can easily see. And actually, in the case of that, like I remember one time having to deal with someone who was just, white guy who wanted to write a big samurai thing. And it's like, hey, here's some interesting history about like the Knights Errant and vague stuff they're doing, which is equivalent to the themes you want to touch upon, but you can get like real weird with stuff because there's medieval margins, monsters, and things like that they could incorporate into things. The whole policies of like being a hedge knight and things like that. And that's way more interesting than another person using words they can't even pronounce. So please don't. And I think last part, just, make it feel like a place that is real enough. But I mean, thought came to me earlier during this, but I forget how it got away from it. But so I wrote a little free zine called Verona, about the city of Verona, following the grand tradition of Shakespeare, another person who has never been to Verona. So it's just like, well, here's some historical notes that I'm just going to apply a lot of incredible biased thoughts on, considering the nature of the time. And in like 18th century Verona, they're trading with the nation of Afar in Africa. And that's kind of like interesting to me because Afar is in like the general Ethiopian territory. And then once you get into like the world wars and the infamous Italian failures to invade Ethiopia. And so it's like you can think of like these weird little bits of connective tissue like that. I only bring that up because I remember noting there's a thing about some like Veronese soldiers on return escorting, just sort of complaining about not being able to get the right sort of dietary needs there, which is the whole reason why they brought cauldrons in World War II. And, just you find the weird little connective bits that are like, oh, this is funny to me and to other people who know what I'm talking about, and you enjoy that. You got to treat it like a dad joke. The caffeine is hitting me now.
I'd like to circle back to the point about who gets to write about what where.
Yes.
But this is so I'll get back to it once we're done with the question about research.
Yeah.
I also have a comment on that.
That's great. Let's spin that.
But I'll also get back to it later.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on research first?
Yeah, just to briefly chime in with my process, such as exists, which is I just follow every rabbit hole I can find, and I write down anything interesting, and I set my Google Docs to 2 columns, and then just make huge lists of numbered or bulleted, and then I write down both like anything interesting, usually like just a couple of words, like bacteria that eat cyanide or something, and then I have a link to a Wikipedia article or a news article or some obscure scientific site from 2003, or even a book reference of like, here's the page number that I found this on, and then I just keep going. And then eventually, a month later, when I've forgotten everything, I go back and look at those notes and sift through them and say, what's interesting, what looks good, what do I want to read more on, what rabbit holes can I go in further. But the initial process is just reading anything and everything and then just grabbing the most interesting things in the shortest tidbits I can.
Sam, if you release your designer notes with Sea of Sand, I will read them. I will look through
see
them.
those. They're bad.
I
They're
do.
bad.
I want to see. I want the big map with the yarn all over it in your Google Docs. Awesome. Well, let's talk about that, because I do think it is a big place, especially when we're talking about locations, when we're talking about the cultures that come with that location, who gets to write about what. And here's what I'll say. Because I don't know what anybody's going to say. It's okay. People should have nuanced feelings about these things. We shouldn't be using nuanced feelings ever to undercut or discredit what other people are saying, which I'm not super worried about anybody in this group doing.
Yeah.
But I want to have that conversation because I enjoy the nuance, and I want to shout that out at the top because it's important, and it shouldn't be dismissed because it's how we actually get to cleaner understanding of things. So Zedek, you brought it up. Why don't you kick us off there about what you were thinking?
When Brian mentioned it occurred to me, and this is something that we face, Manka and I face semi-frequently, is that we face the opposite problem, in that a person, like the reality of it is that a lot of our audience comes from a lot of the audience for Thousand Islands, like a lot of people who buy our zines comes from the Anglo-European sort of sphere, right? The Anglo-sphere, basically. And a lot of, the feedback we most often get is like, we love your zines, but I don't dare to run them. I want to be careful. I'm too afraid to make a mistake, right? And so it's really this thing about it's interesting and an important discussion to have, especially amongst white people, amongst yourselves. But the crutch of tell me whether I can stay in my lane or not, it's not up to me to give you a rule you can follow. That's one thing.
If I may caveat real quick, this was specifically to a newcomer. Like, by all means, take bold risks eventually, but for the love of God, not at the start. That's all I really wanted to.
No, that's fine. I mean, Brian, I don't think like I said, none of this is meant to be. I mean, people can disagree.
This is not a rebuttal to you, Brian.
Oh yeah, no. I just wanted to say it because like you and I have had this conversation prior, and so this is early morning mind for me.
Awesome.
And so the one of the things that we I don't want to. I very much understand where the question is coming from, because people do want to take care and they do want to approach things with some sort of consideration. And I think I'm fortunate enough to have the people who are buying our zines anyway are already kind of thinking about this thing to begin with. But then the sort of dealing with the sort of hesitation is that, I, as a person from my region, I'm frequently writing about things that I actually have no right writing about. For example, my ancestry doesn't have headhunting, and I know people who do. For one of our zines, Heleng is very much based on the stories that we've heard about the forest nomadic Batik people, who I have no connection with and have not been to their sort of ancestral area. So I don't have any experiential experience. The only way I can sort of justify it in my head and everybody should have sort of mixed feelings about this, but the thing about it is that I'm not in the business of representing anybody. I don't want this to be a dismissal of the importance of like a bad representation or whatever, and that's why Maka and I very much emphasize the idea of a recentering. So like we are recentering our imagination, not only in terms of the Southeast Asian imagination, but me and Macau specifically as diaspora Chinese people in Southeast Asia. And it is the idea of like, I'm writing about these things because I am interested in them, and I'm interested in them to the point that I am willing to be humbled by what I read about it, and will never claim that I am more expert than anybody else. So the idea that I'm authority at all is sidestepped completely. And the idea that I have a personal connection to this. I want to circle obliquely back to something previously that Brian has said about the idea of hometowns. I found that it was only when I moved back to my hometown, and yeah, you know, Brian's right that the hometown that I wanted to live in is no longer there. But in the sort of returning, you do find a certain connection to place, which is new. And from that, I've been writing and making art. And I think that's for me at least, the truest place where world building comes from. I am ultimately letting any audience person or any, like the people who run our games, are being invited to my home. So that's the purpose of whatever research or whatever, you know, like I don't like factually right, factually not right, historical, ahistorical. Is this right for me to write? Is this not? No, it's like you are being invited into ZXU's home.
I love that.
Yeah. So.
Awesome. Luca, you had some thoughts you wanted to hop in on this.
Yeah. So this is just sort of a comment on it, but you point, so in terms of how to write about other places or how to approach them, like Zedek put it much more eloquently than I could. He has a way with words that I don't. But there was something you brought up with where you were giving this advice not to touch the topic of samurai. And then at the same time, you touched the topic of Verona. And as somebody from literally so Verona was a Venetian possession in the territory, and so is the country, so is the town I'm from, and it's from that historical region. And it feels very uncomfortable when you make a line that says, oh, this is beyond the pale, but here, Verona in the 18th century, this is fine. And this feels a questionable distinction to me, because from the perspective of a person in the 21st century, let's say in New York State, both of those are very alien and very different places. And also they have local communities with local cultures, traditions, and everything. And it brings up the difficult question, because if you start asking, okay, how do you stay in your lane, you eventually end up in a point where everybody can only write about their own personal individual experiences without referencing to any broader shared universal human experiences, or also comparison with other cultures. And I don't think the strong argument for avoiding other cultures works. I think it's important to approach them in good faith and with interest. But once you have enough interest in a place, that you invest time in learning about it and trying to understand it, I think a person has a right to deal with that. And I think it's a shame that this opportunity for expanding our empathetic universes and understanding how other people live, which is what a lot of what games are about, that this has become too problematic a topic. And problematic is a broad word and whatever, but too problematic a topic for people to even touch on. Because one of the core things that role-playing games really do is they do let you experience empathy by trying to be somebody else. Like that's sort of the core of it, trying to be somebody else in a different place, in a different time. And this then circles back to what Zedek mentioned about how people approach him, like asking if or how they may do this in a nuanced way. So it feels like there's a disconnect there.
Brian, why don't you go first, then I can.
All right. So I understand what it is that you're saying, but there are several things that need to be considered and factored in that. And one is there's a difference between current hegemonic power structures and traditionally colonized and demonized populations. James Mendez Hodds wrote a really good article about orcs and sort of talking about, like, hey, people of my specific ethnicity were considered to be part of a martial race, really only good for butchery. And, when you have those easy thematic translations into games and the dehumanization that comes with it, no one is going to look at a work that I do and say, yes, this person is an authority on this, because I am not from groups that are historically power-having. But if another random person who happens to be white and doesn't have any sort of background in the cultures they're writing on, like a John Wick type, decides to write a Legend of the Five Rings, maps back here because I own those, people might take that person as an expert in that field, and that might culture their viewing of things and cause terrible things to, go down the line, which is to say, I have faced pretty intense racism from people who got their Indian thoughts from Legend of the Five Rings, where Mecha Shiva kills all the children in India to raise a Tiger Man army from hell. And I wish that was hyperbole, both in the racism I have faced from those people and the actual things that people put to paper. So it's a matter of the amount of harm that's going on, the amount of actual, historic harm that's going on in what was written, as well as the influence that's going to come from it. So, say if I wrote something that was about a historically underprivileged group and it was not necessarily flattering, and I'm not part of that historically underprivileged group, and some bad stuff might happen as a result, I would be in the wrong. And I would be in the wrong because I was not in my lane on that. I took too many bold risks that really only risk to harm other people. I don't think anyone will necessarily suffer being called the Veronian equivalent of Apu Nasa Pina Pedalon for what I wrote. But, boy, howdy, have I gotten that one.
So an issue that comes up for me in this area a lot, and it is a little bit different, but I also think it connects in strongly. I also think some of these conversations are most particular to North Americans and British people. Is really where a lot of this comes in. There is a huge amount of Americanism that transcends some of even racial boundaries because of the perspective of anyone who has grown up in this country or in Britain for the most part encounters.
So to sort of tack on to what Tony you said, and also Brian you said about the hegemony of things, I think that's very true. And I think very sadly, at least specifically to role-playing games, but generally, for example, the Anglophone market is basically US, UK centered. right? And so the issue for me is about representation, the idea and rubrics of representation, because you're right in that, okay, like people might mistake a white person like John Wick to be an authority, but also conversely, speaking as somebody, and I think Luca can sort of relate to this to a certain degree, being from Eastern Europe, that we've had I've had the experience of like seeing diaspora Asian people want to represent my culture to the Western market, and like feeling, what gives you a fucking right? Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's a matter of degrees, and so like there's something wrong with the sort of rubric of representation itself. It's not right that I need to get crumbs from like when Disney makes Raya the Last Dragon, right? Or even I don't want to speak on behalf of Pacific Islanders, but Moana, as I enjoyed the movie, but why is it being seen as a triumph for Pacific Islanders?
Yeah.
So it really is that sort of thing of like the staying in the lane thing. I feel like it is a frame that we're going to split hairs and everybody's going to get shit for it.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think we talk about representation, like all right, so I, as a, my mother came over to America back in the 60s, 70s, like as a child. And my Irish side of the family was exiled back in the early 1800s. And they came over here and fought a bunch of wars. And somehow I came out of that. Do I necessarily have a right to write about my Bihari heritage? That's a nuanced question, because then you also have to look into the very hegemonic power structures of India and the caste system therein, and how Hinduism exists as a gigantic power structure as equivalent to, Christendom in the West. And those all get into a bunch of other situations. But it's sort of the thing where if I write about that, I am representing myself. Whereas if I were writing about, say, Native Americans, I would be presenting that. And the fact that I'm presenting that is different because I don't have the skin in the game. Yeah. And it's a real, I think, like there's an important distinction that
I'm not sorry for interrupting, Brian.
No, it's all good.
If we get into this, this is why I think the right to write about something is the wrong question to ask, because if like we're going to get into like my personal sort of lineage and bona fides. Like I am a Chinese person. My ethnic roots are in China. Does that give me when I write about China, that doesn't mean I'm representing myself? I don't think so. And to a lesser degree, that's true for everybody. So like when we get do I have the right to represent myself? I think the question of who yourself really is, and this is where it comes to what roots do you have in which places, and the sort of honesty involved with that. Like for example, where I know I've talked to many people from Southeast Asia, for example, which sort of like communicate the idea that, I'm feeling kind of uncomfortable that our diaspora gets to do this rather than us. And that's a question about hegemony and about access and about very frequently about language. For example, I, as an Anglophone person, have way more privilege than the people I'm supposedly writing about. Like everybody you see online from Southeast Asia that is engaging with RPG Twitter is a middle class and above person. You can't run away from that. So the question of like who gets to write something, like just stop pretending you're representing. I feel like that's the most honest.
Yeah. I mean that's the very like,
because the idea of representation has a profit motive behind it. That's
I don't
why
feel that's
you do it.
Always necessarily the case, but I know what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, so I would say, especially within Western culture, the motives are rarely as clean as we would like them to be, even if it's not profit driven. Like for me, vanity is way more of a temptation than profit ever. It's like it's easier for me to be generous with money, but I far more gravitate towards notoriety or notice, and that can oftentimes be a jaundicing or a fault within my pursuit of anything that I'm looking to pursue, that I have to check myself on a whole lot. But like I said, for me, the big thing, and Luke, I want to give you a chance to just say one more thing before we pivot out. Not because I don't want to talk about this, but we will talk about this for another 2 hours.
We should talk about sandboxes at some point. Sandbox conversation.
But like, I think we also we have to consider, especially as Americans, and I would include, even though we're very different, I would include the UK in the same group, though I'm not a part of it. So if somebody in the UK wants to disagree with me, great. As having some distinctive realities that we're facing, that in all honesty, the people who are on the Mediterranean rim of Europe, who are Slavs, who are people from Eastern Europe, don't experience the same things in the same way, because there's a different cultural reality there, and that's why I really want to make sure I give an opportunity to response, because it's something that I experience a lot and have had to have a lot of conversations about over the last year. When people ask me certain questions, I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I can give you an answer, but it only makes sense. That question only makes sense within a Western American context. It doesn't make sense anywhere else in the world. And we have to kind of divest ourselves of thinking that perspective is the prime perspective in these spaces. Luca, do you have any more thoughts you want to add to this?
Well, like I understand where Zedek and where Brian are coming from, and like honestly, like in my personal work, what I actually try to do is I just try to make stuff up from the ground up, even the stuff that's influenced by other things, like imaginary fantasy with fewer links to actual existing real world things, way better. When it comes to writing about marginalization, taking an existing group and changing one vowel in their name, and suddenly this is completely fantasy. Yeah, that doesn't really cut it. So but so my general approach is just try to be careful. But when you mentioned about America, that's actually a very interesting thing, because obviously it's the cultural superpower in the world today. We are all talking English right now, and we think in English, and we make games in English, and movies happen in English, and so on. So that is sort of the core of it. But yeah, the rest of the world, it's quite different. But because the U.S. is so big, I mean, it calls itself America. It just claims the whole hemisphere.
Yeah.
But it's so big that if you grow up and live within the U.S. culture, you can generally stay within this culture. So you're not faced with the discontinuity. And this is actually an interesting topic that brings us back to locations and what we're talking about, which is a thing that I've experienced by moving around and living in different places, which is that while living in just a single place, there are certain facts of society and culture that take on the weight of physical facts. Just like the law of gravity applies everywhere, certain things like the way that people talk, the way that people perceive other people, interact with different groups, categorize, stereotype people, and so on, all of those have sort of the same weight as the law of gravity. This is just the way the world is. If you want a fancy German word, Weltanschauung, worldview. There you go. So, and now a very funny story, small story, very specific, but after a certain point, high school in Europe and then university in Europe, and quite limited interactions with East Asia. It was just very, very far away, especially when you don't have a lot of money. Going to East Asia, it's just not going to happen. And I wasn't too heavily into it. And so one thing that sort of struck me was looking at the traditional Chinese and Korean paintings, was that oh wow, because the pine tree is quite an important motif in East Asian painting, especially China and Korea, and the pine trees. I was looking at them and I was like, wow, these pine trees are all stylized in a very specific way. They're gnarled and have like knobbly branches and the pine needles and stuff like that. And I was like, how come they always, for over hundreds of years, they stylize them in this way? because I know very well what a pine tree is like. Like the Mediterranean is full of pine trees, right? So it's like you get the stem and then you have like a round bushy thing with needles on it, and cicadas, and they go like bzz, bzz, bzz in them. So I know what a pine tree. So why are they stylizing all these pine trees like they've been gnarled and blown by the winds? And there's like the motif where the pine tree represents like scholarly virtues and persistence in the face of adversity. So, you know, I was like, wow, like that this kind of stylization persists over hundreds of years. And then I kind of arrive in South Korea, and we're driving from Incheon Airport into Seoul, and I see a bunch of pine trees, and it's like it's a different species. It looks like that. You know, and that's like that captures this thing. It's like you grow up in a cultural worldview, and it's like a thing makes sense, and then you come somewhere else, and it's like, nope. Nope. This is just
that may be the perfect articulation, just to kind of put a bow on it, of like that's what good locations do when we write them in games, is your players enter into them and all of a sudden something goes nope. You know, like and they're able to encounter something different and new, and that can be empathy building. And I do think this is like, to bring it back around to design, I do think our challenge within that, I think from Brian, you know, you talking about like, hey, maybe this isn't your first foray into this. Build the skill set, build the ability to do this research, draw from your own life experience, or gain the knowledge and and do the research and have the experiences you need to grow there. Stepping outside of our own biases while inviting people into our homes. I love all those pieces. Charlie, y'all didn't have a ton to offer.
I gotta apologize for sort of hijacking.
No, it's such a good point and such an important part of this, and I love.
I don't want to disagree. I don't disagree with you, Brian. It's just that it's.
I honestly, I could have summed it all up in a much more succinct way, and that is saying your first project as a person who is possibly a person from America who is white should not be another attempt at doing samurai.
Yeah. And that again, for me, the key thing is like, is this person from America? Oh, absolutely. This should
because not only everything we just talked about, but you're competing against over 100 other people who have had the exact same idea. Right. So what are you doing that makes me actually care about this?
So
can I suggest something, because I sort of lost this thread, but I finally found it again. When you mentioned something about the hometown, this is what I wanted to say. Like when you start writing a location or like an RPG thing, write about the town you grew up in. Right, that's your first thing.
Write about the house you grew up in. Turn your house into a dungeon.
Yes,
the metaphorical house in a way.
And not being facetious, I truly believe this. Like, if you can make that sing, you're in a good place.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Because that's how I did
writing
it.
advice in general.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can find all of your biases and examine those when you talk about your hometown, because that's where you're from.
I love it.
I've gotten like one or two emails that say, "Oh, we love your zines. I could never write a zine like this because like the town I grew up in is not as interesting as your life obviously is." Like, come on, like you grew up in wherever it is in America.
Oh yeah, I mean my town sucks. It's incredibly interesting.
Brian is a prime example of that not being true. Like.
Yeah.
Your
every town's got a dark
every town
past.
in America,
Every town in America has a dark past.
Yeah. And I want to shout out Lawful Neutral in the chat has been
patient.
Sam just said Port Dickinson. Interesting. Lawful Neutral in the chat has mentioned a couple times their Low Country Crawl, which is a Southern Gothic, by which we mean Southern U.S. Gothic horror anthology. But they worked really intentionally across, even though that is Lawful Neutral's culture, to work with other, specifically Black and POC individuals who are from that region, to develop it so it would have that grounded feel from a cross-cultural perspective. It was a great example of taking something that is very U.S. American, and diving deep into it in a really tremendous way. We got to play it on stream. I had a blast. I want to give everybody a chance to go around in just 1 second. If you have a final thought, something that you want people to think about from any part of our conversation or something new from this before we close out. A couple things we have coming up later on today after a short break for me. We've got a funeral party. We're going to be celebrating the life and work of Stella Joy Condrey and summoning her ghost. She's alive now, but she will be dead in the future, so we're going to summon her ghost through time to sit down and join us for another funeral party. We do it the final Friday of every month with the folks over at Exalted Funeral. So I will also say this: we have the biggest announcement we have ever made on stream happening this afternoon at that event, and you should show up and find out what it is. We also on Saturday are playing 9 Lives to Valhalla by Gym Room Games. It's their Zemo offering. It's about cats. Anytime you roll, something dies, very likely you, but you have 9 lives. And you can also challenge death, which is the GM, and become the GM for the rest of the session. I'm going to try to do that late in the game. Not early in the game, but late in the game. So come watch us. All men and women and other humans have died, and the age of cats has come upon us. So that's Saturday morning. If you also want to come back on Sunday, we just brought in a new solo reviewer. Armanda is going to be doing Alone with Armanda. They are solo RPG actual plays, followed by short interviews. So just like the actual plays we normally do, but just Armanda playing. This time it's going to be 1,000 Empty Lights with Alfred Valley. That's going to be Sunday afternoon here in Eastern time. And then we'll have a polished review from Armanda coming to the channel shortly after that. Finally, if you want to support any or all the things that we do here, you can always become a content champion. But right now, we are in the middle of crowdfunding Through the Void. It's our anti-canon influenced a lot by a lot of the different conversations we've had here in some of these creators. Minimalist RPG system set in space. There's some amazing anti-canon concepts, but there's some amazing location tools. Brian is actually going to be one of our contributors at some point whenever we nail that down. I'm super excited about that, but it is a minimalist space RPG that we're itch funding right now. You're going to see also a lot of Latin American voices in this one, and down we go. We had a lot of kind of RPGC voices that we brought to the table that we were really excited to work with for Through the Void. We want to really empower some of our other kind of international teams of RPG in the RPG community to come in and do that. So currently we're funding for Lucas Rollum and Alex Gnarled Monster to create a mission together. It's our final goal in that process. We'd love your support. With all that said, I'd love to whip around, let everybody else talk about what they're up to, and give any final thoughts that they have, if they have them. Go in kind of reverse order. So Charlie, do you want to lead us off? Tell people where they can find you, what you're working on right now, but also do you have any closing thoughts about location building or world building?
Yeah, so you can find me at Feral Indie Studio on itch.io. Currently, I am putting together a zine that will be funding on itch called As the Gods Demand, which is, it's not a setting, but it is a look at basically using gods and following what they demand in order to get power, and kind of forcing you to interact with the world based on this, like, creed, if you wish to follow it. And not to steal the phrase that we came up with earlier, but, like, I love the idea for locations to write about your home. And that is not necessarily a place, that is not necessarily a building, it might not even be a place in time, but it is a thing that you exist in. And I believe some of the best writing comes from when you write about your home.
Awesome. Zedek, how about you? Tell people who you are, where they can find your stuff online. You just put out a big Reach update this morning. I was super excited to read through it, or this evening for you.
Oh, right.
Tell people what you're working on and where they can find you.
Zedek, Zedek Siu on Twitter. Me and Macau and Grace are working on a book called Reach of the Roach God, which will be our first 1,000 Islands book. And yeah, I'm writing the second adventure now. Pretty pleased with it. I gotta say, like, the conversation got away. Like, I pushed the conversation away from us, but I really wanted to talk about how art influences world building and creating a sense of place, because that's definitely A Thousand Islands would not exist in the way that it does without Mankao's art and all the unseen work that goes into, like, because the text is generic by, is terminologically generic by design, but the imagery is very specific. So yeah, I wanted to sort of, I don't know. Now we can just think about it.
I'm always happy to sit down with you. So if the two of y'all want to come back on at some point in the future, if you want to have the Thousand Islands team on, I'd love to talk to y'all. I'd love to look at some of the art. I think there's a ton of people who would be interested more in what y'all are doing with that setting and series. So always happy to have you back on to dive deeper into that.
And but also, like, because we had illustrators here on, like, Luca and Charles. Like,
yeah.
Sorry, guys.
Okay.
You're good. Sam, go ahead and hit us up. Tell us where we can find you, what you do, and any final thoughts that you have.
Yeah, I'm at Head of the Goat on Twitter, headofthegoat.io for some of the stuff. Currently, I'm working on a project called Seas of Sand that should be going live for backers in the next month, hopefully, and then releasing to everybody else later. Don't quote me on that. And then I've got a couple projects for Zemo going up in one of them the next few days, and one of them hopefully, and then one of them later, midway through February. One of them is a mothership time travel adventure, and the other one's a weird biblical text. My final thought, if I have them, is to, if you're writing systems for your settings, to make them as diegetic as you can. Is to ground them in the logic of the world and make the rules reflect things that are already true, just set into codified rules text, rather than trying to create new game systems out of whole cloth. As an easy example, in Seas, the sands are liquid during the day and they're solid at night. And I can just tell you that sentence, you basically know how it works. And I've written a bunch of explication for that and details and adjustments and modifications. But that's all grounded in the fictional reality of the game. And so I try to build that way rather than the other way around.
And it is way more sciencey than you think, because I 100% asked that question when we did our actual play earlier this year. It's a phenomenal studying toolkit, and I'm so glad we got to have you on today to have this conversation too, Sam. Luca, tell people where they can find you, where they can follow your work, but also any final thoughts you have.
Yeah, so again, my name is Luca Reyes. You can find me on Wizard Thief Fighter, all one word, either on the website or on Patreon. Probably also on Facebook. I don't check there that regularly. On Twitter, it's Strato Metaship. Wizard Thief Fighter is also on itch.io and Drive-Thru RPG. Currently working on finishing up the CCAT system. The skeleton of it first appeared in UVG, so now finishing it up together with Sacred Tarsos, who's doing the digital SRD for it. So it's gonna have an app to go with it, so you'll be able to run it through that as well. We're now at version 0.80, so the end is in sight. It's nearly done. The white whale has nearly been sighted and filmed for posterity. And when it comes to locations, I actually wanted to say almost the exact same thing as Charlie about, like, writing about home and places you know. And the thing I would say is, how to actually make it interesting as well. One thing you can do, and it's a very simple practice, is take a place or a thing you know, and then make one thing about it weird or different in some way. And then figure out how it goes from it in that sense. So the way Sam talked about, like, you do one thing in this desert, you can also do, like, one thing in the house, and then what follows from it. And if you want to make it even weirder, like, hey, the next room in the house, you can add a second thing that goes weird, or like the second floor or something like that. But like even just changing like one thing is usually going to be enough, because each location that you add, there's only a limited number of weird new information you can pass on to players, or you can pass on to the game master, or referee, or whoever is running it. So change one thing.
Awesome. Love it. Brian, final thoughts, and where can folks find you?
Final thoughts? My deepest apologies to Sam and Charles. We can talk about sandboxes properly at some time. Rather than this conversation.
I've been itching to hear you talk for a while now. So like,
this is more my realization. Like I had to write lesson plans for a grad thing about iterative procedural generation. I've just never done that actual talk. You can find me goatmansgoblet.itch.io. Most of my stuff is under $3. I mentioned several products, and most of them are free. The ones that I mentioned here, anyway. Yeah, I'm working on big new Best Left Buried setting toolkit book, which is for next year. Finishing the last of a bunch of charts and tables I promised for Academies of the Arcane. There's only so many ways to describe color and tone before you start to lose your marbles. And I got like 6 left, and they're driving me up a wall. Let's see. Raykel 2 eventually, and Yatra, where I'm probably going to piss off a lot of Brahmins, but hey, they can suck it.
That's
yeah, I'll state
best
that
final
boldly.
thought ever.
Yeah, no, that's me. If anyone actually wants me to answer questions about sandbox stuff, I'm not doing anything on Twitter today besides probably being angry. So yeah, hit me up.
Awesome.
I feel as though I've pulled the rug out and prevented y'all from having that.
No, so again, the and it's like I will say this, like I don't mind for conflict in these, and I am kind of a naturally person who's like I love actual nuance. I don't love when people use the like, hey, I've got nuance here because I really disagree with you but refuse to just tell you that. I love exploring ideas more deeply, and I think the best thing about a community conversation is when we actually see it go somewhere that is about something we want to be talking about. It is important to what we're doing and is still connected to the conversation. Like I don't think anything we talked about isn't connected to that. Right, on different levels of scaling in and out. But yeah, I love sandboxy shit too. So anytime any of y'all want to come back and talk sandboxes specifically, we can do that, because I think the work that Charlie, Sam, Brian all do in that area is so good for just procedural places that start out way more abstract and get more and more concrete as you go through them, which is most settings you play in. But still,
I'd like to be part of that conversation, please.
Yes, Charlie, let's do that. We can talk about just
getting in the sandbox, getting dirty.
Yeah, this is great.
Aiden Christensen won't be there. It'll be great. No, with that said, again, we've got a ton of streams coming up. Thanks everybody for being here. If you've got an idea for a community conversation you'd love to see besides sandboxes, feel free to drop us a line. A big part of when we do these is when either I get niched for them or a conversation comes up in the community that we really want to talk more about, and just kind of give space for that to happen. I would love for you to follow all of these creators. Their information is right below their beautiful faces online, and I would love even more if you went and supported their work in whatever way that you can. They're phenomenal people to sit down and play games with, collaborate with, or in Charlie's case, get kicked out of a bar with. With all that said,
most fun you'll have getting kicked out of a bar.
I'll be back later on today for our funeral party. Hope you can join us then for the big announcement we've got set. Until then, bye everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.